The lawmen who tamed the Wild West. The Old West, where justice was often as swift as a bullet, and the men who upheld the law walked a fine line between peacekeeping and outlawing themselves. In a land of bandits, cattle rustlers, and gunslingers, there were a few who stood tall, wearing the badge that made them the only thing standing between civilization and pure chaos. Some were heroes, some were killers, and some were just as dangerous as the men they were chasing. Tonight, I'll tell you about 8 of the most famous sheriffs and lawmen to ever wear a star in the Old West. Men whose stories have been passed down through history, their names etched in legend. Pat Garrett, the man who killed Billy the Kid. If you've ever heard the story of Billy the Kid, then you've heard of Pat Garrett. He was a lawman with a simple mission: to rid New Mexico of one of its most notorious outlaws. Some say Garrett and Billy were once friends, but that didn't stop Garrett from doing what had to be done. In the dead of night, July 14th, 1881, Garrett tracked Billy to a small adobe house in Fort Sumner. As the young outlaw stepped into the darkness, Garrett fired. The kid fell, and just like that, one of the West's most famous gunmen was gone. But Garrett's story didn't end there. He lived his life chased by controversy, some even saying Billy survived, and it was all a setup. In the end, Garrett himself met a bullet, shot in the back on a lonely New Mexico road. The 3 guardsmen, the marshals who cleaned up Indian territory. Not all lawmen worked alone. In the wild Oklahoma territory, 3 U.S. Marshals became legends together: Bill Tillman, Chris Madsen, and Heck Thomas. They called them the 3 Guardsmen, and they had one job: wipe out the gangs running rampant across the land. For years, these men hunted down outlaws like the Doolin-Dalton gang, never backing down from a fight. With relentless determination, they cleared the territory of some of the most dangerous criminals in the West. They weren't just lawmen, they were legends in their own time. John Coffey, Captain Jack Hayes, the fearless Texas Ranger. Before the Texas Rangers became the force they are today, there was one man who defined what it meant to be a ranger: John Coffey, Captain Jack Hayes. He wasn't just a sheriff, he was a warrior, a man who rode into battle against Comanche warriors and outlaws alike. In the 1840s, Texas was still a dangerous frontier, but Hayes turned the tide. He revolutionized gunfighting by using Colt revolvers, giving his men the firepower they needed to survive in close combat. They say he could shoot the wings off a fly at 10 paces, and that no man ever bested him in a fight. Hayes lived to old age, but his name still echoes in the legend of the Texas Rangers. Doc Holliday, the deadly dentist turned lawman. He wasn't a sheriff in the traditional sense, but if you were in a town where Doc Holliday was backing the law, you'd best not cause trouble. Born John Henry Holliday, he was a gambler, a gunfighter, and a man dying from tuberculosis. But that didn't stop him from becoming one of the deadliest men in the West. His friendship with Wyatt Earp led him to stand by the law in Tombstone, Arizona. And on October 26, 1881, in a narrow alley behind the OK Corral, he helped gun down the Clanton and McClory outlaws in one of the most famous shootouts in history. They say he was as fast as lightning and twice as deadly. Dave Allison, the youngest sheriff in Texas history. Not all lawmen were seasoned old gunfighters. Some earned their badge young. Dave Allison was only 27 when he became sheriff of Midland, Texas. But don't let his age fool you. He was as tough as they come. He built a reputation as a fearless manhunter, tracking down criminals across Texas and beyond. He was a lawman through and through, but in 1923, the law couldn't protect him. He was ambushed and killed by outlaws who wanted revenge. Even in death, his legend lived on. The Earp brothers, the lawmen of Tombstone. Wyatt Virgil and Morgan Earp weren't just lawmen, they were Tombstone's lawmen. Virgil was the town marshal, and when outlaws pushed too hard, the Earp brothers pushed back. Their defining moment? The gunfight at the OK Corral. With Doc Holliday at their side, they faced down the Clanton and McClory gang in a shootout that lasted less than 30 seconds, but became the stuff of legend. Morgan was murdered soon after, and Wyatt set out on his infamous vendetta ride, hunting down the men responsible. Their story became one of the most famous in Western history: Bat Masterson, the sheriff who became a journalist. Most men who lived by the gun died by it, but Bat Masterson was different. A gunfighter, gambler, and sheriff of Dodge City, he tamed some of the wildest streets in the West. But instead of dying in a gunfight, he put down his revolver and he moved to New York City and became a newspaper writer, telling the stories of the Old West himself. A man who once fought outlaws now wrote their tales for the world to read. He lived to see the dawn of the 20th century, one of the few lawmen to do so. Wild Bill Hickok. The lawman who died with a dead man's hand. No name is more legendary than Wild Bill Hickok. A scout, a gambler, and a sheriff, Hickok had a reputation as one of the fastest guns in the West. His law-keeping days in Kansas were short, but his legacy was long. In Deadwood, Dakota Territory, he sat at a poker table, his back to the door, his one fatal mistake. A coward named Jack McCall shot him from behind. When Hickok fell, his cards hit the floor. 2 black aces, 2 black eights. The dead man's hand was born. The last echoes of the Old West. The Old West was a time of chaos, but these men fought to bring order, even if they had to do it with a gun in hand. Their names are now legend, their stories passed down through time. And so I ask you, if you had to wear the badge back then, would you have been tough enough to stand tall?